Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to have you here again. I really look forward to these times every week and these amazing discussions that we have. Tonight, we're going to talk about empathy and sympathy and the blocks maybe that get in the way of us really being empathetic. And I'm not sure where this conversation is going to go, but hi, Carolyn. Do you want to lead the way?
Hi, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Feminine Force Field again. Amazing to have you here. And we have our Lisa Jane TV and Caroline Flourish by Design TV up today. So it's real collaboration, isn't it? So that's new. And yeah, it's a question that came the last couple of days, and I was kind of looking at this and thought, Lisa, we should try and open it up and see where it goes. And I think, yeah, sympathy, what is the difference between sympathy and empathy? And it's such an important conversation to have for these times, because the understanding of that kind of leads to the solution, I suppose, of where we're at. And I think because sympathy is I suppose, showing compassion or showing or verbalizing, say if even if it was grief or whatever, that you're verbalizing a sympathy for somebody's situation. So you're sympathizing for something that somebody's going through, but you're not necessarily entering into that situation with them. You're keeping your distance a little bit as well. So there's kind of a pity version of that too, which is a little bit more cold again. So pity is kind of looking on and kind of being glad that you're not really in that situation and that you're pitying the person. So it can be quite cold and disconnected. Empathy is, or sympathy is, its kind of step forward where you're compassionate for them, but you're still not. There's a block there where you're not actually feeling the other person's feelings. And then empathy is actually you're entering into the experience with the other person so that they feel you feeling them, you know? So that's where I would say empathy is the cement that builds secure connection, because it's like if you were thinking of, I was trying to think of an analogy, because at the moment I'm teaching analogy in college to the students at the moment, and I was saying, how we teach sometimes through different pictures, and I was thinking about how you could describe it as sympathy is if you're building a wall, and you had the bricks, and the bricks were being put on top of each other, and yeah, they're being laid on top of each other, and that's sympathy. But they're not going to stay connected, and they're not actually going to merge into being this solid connected structure if there's no empathy, because empathy is like the concrete that sticks the blocks together, so it's like there's two different people, two different blocks, and you can lay one on top of each other and they can touch and they can say, oh, I'm sorry, or whatever. But if you're not actually entering into the experience of what the other person is feeling, you're not really one with them, So when you lay down the cement, which is like the empathy, and they just become solid together, and they're always connected and they're really strong. So like the societies that's built on empathy is a very strong structure, it has this connection that can't be pulled down very easily, where if you've got a society that's built on like the sympathy or pity, it's just like these blocks that are built on top of each other, and then you lean up against it and the whole thing crumbles and falls down because there's no true connection there. So the true connection is building, using that cement, the cement of connection, which is, for that solid connection, is empathy. And empathy has a few different qualities to it. So it is always going to look through the perspective of the other person. So it's not looking through your eyes, it's actually entering in. It's like nearly, you're coming out from yourself, going around the back of the person and coming back in. So it's like, the shape of the heart, so you're kind of coming out from yourself, you're going behind the other person and coming back into their perspective and looking through their eyes. So you're imagining how they might be feeling through their perspective, not your perspective, looking on, facing onto them and saying, oh, this sometimes, because there can be judgment there, when it comes to sympathy, you're sympathizing, but there's also a judgment around that. Empathy, there's no judgment. And there's also the recognition of the other person's emotion. Even if you haven't ever experienced that before, you can feel their emotions and you are connected to that. And you're feeling the feelings of that person within your own body. So it's a very uncomfortable place to be. And I think that is really what happens when people don't want to enter into that, because it calls for us to feel those feelings ourselves. And it takes a courage to do that. A lot of people shy away from it and they don't want to feel those intense feelings, and they don't want to, because then when you feel those intense feelings, then it calls for action. It calls for you to do something that can help them or support them or to bring them along in that journey, even just to listen to them. But it there's a selflessness required in that takes an investment. So I suppose the blocks, I would say, sometimes people have been numbed in their own feelings and their own experience of life, that they don't have as much access to the feeling sense in their own body, that can't they can't feel, or they won't feel. It depends, the other person, or they don't want to feel vulnerable to feel that as well, so I suppose it's a real skill and it's a great to open it up, because there's a huge difference between sympathy and empathy. And especially I've experienced it over the last couple of years with my parents dying, the difference and the feeling, because that is an experience. Words are very limited. So you can receive sympathy and pity, and then you can receive empathy. Sympathy is beautiful to receive. It's really it's compassion and people giving their condolences and stuff like that. But when you receive empathy, it actually can build a bond that will never be broken. It's just, especially when you're in a vulnerable state and you're going through difficult times, the people who actually show empathy, you'll never forget. You'll never forget. They're the ones that you kind of, it's like the harvest time, when you're dividing the seeds from the chaff. You see who's really true to you and who really cares about you, because of how connected they are to you, I suppose, and especially it's like in those painful times, the people who have that, ability to really enter in with you, because it's very courageous, but it's like there's a massive bond that's built with people like that. I think, when you go through something, and then it's a real education, actually. It's a real education. I think I've learned so much about that over the last couple of years, and actually I've also learned what pity, the feeling of receiving pity, is really horrible. It's very destructive, it's very cold, and it's very disconnected feeling. It's like being put out in the cold, like being like shut out in the cold when you're in your most vulnerable state. Be put out into the freezing cold and the door's locked. That, and you have received that as well, which is it's such a, there's so many nuances to that when you've gone through something. And yeah, it's so important to really bring that out, because I think empathy is the crown jewels for humanity. Like that's what we are, makes us stand apart, is when people show empathy for each other, because we can really, it's a creative force, like, because the minute you feel empathy for somebody, you nearly can't but take action, because you're feeling the feelings of the other person, and you're kind of, compelled to do something in your power, whatever's in your power that you can do. So it's got this massive force behind it. It's, I suppose it's love in action, really, is empathy, because you're going into, you're feeling the feelings. You can't but have a reaction to that, and the reaction is then action, into something, that you want to do to make their life a little bit easier or whatever. And that kind of enriches your life, because you're building that beautiful connection, and then you've also brought that out in yourself, that maybe was dormant, and it's an expression of who you are then in your truth, where you can actually, people blossom in helping other people, when people start to, that's the blossoming, really, when you can enter into the difficulty of life, and then your truth kind of starts to shine and starts to kind of unfold from there. And how that can, the more you do that, then you become a different person, so it's really a choice, so it's a fascinating thing to open up and discuss, because maybe there's not much education around that either, Lisa. We talk about,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
and it's interesting what you're saying, because there's a few things that have been popping up in my mind. Is, first of all, there's a lot of lip service given to empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So this understanding that empathy is different to sympathy, and is better in that you're validating the feelings, like you're actually you can relate to the feeling, or you are validating the feeling and accompanying somebody in their feeling is the empathy. But what was occurring for me when you were speaking like that was a few things. First of all, if we're talking about creating more connection with people, like if we're talking about wanting to move into this state of being where the things that we do naturally create more connection rather than division. So I can understand how, with empathy, if I can feel the feeling with you, not just say that I'm feeling the feeling or remember that I felt that feeling once, but I'm actually sharing the experience of that feeling with you, then that sense of separation and disconnection disappears. And what that then takes me into the next thought, which is, there's a lot of very sensitive people out there at the moment that are very aware that they take on other people's emotions, and then that is not a healthy thing for them, because they actually overfeel and take responsibility for that person's feelings. So I think what the discernment here is, if I can feel the feeling with you, and really be willing to hop into that feeling with you and accompany you in that feeling, which is sometimes hard if there's a belief that, for example, that is a weakness, or there might be a belief that that's not a good thing, or like my experience with failure. Like I would have said to you, look, I'm fine with failure, but I actually didn't want to accept the feeling of failure in my body. It was something that I could say, yeah, I'm fine with it, but that was very different to actually being willing to experience that feeling. So empathy, and I think all of that is like, we've got to be really honest. Can I sit with that feeling with that person, or do I have a block to that feeling that that person is going through? Is there something in me that doesn't want to accept or allow that feeling as part of my experience? But at the same time, be aware that I'm not responsible for them feeling that. I'm not responsible. I don't need to abandon myself. I don't need to take that on. And so these are the couple of things that, like, I was feeling when you were talking. So it was like this very fine line, but I can see how empathy does create connection if we're able to get into the feeling state, into that experience, and accompany that person in the feeling experience that they're going through. And also, that's really healing for them to feel
Yes.
accompanied in that experience.
Yeah, that's the healing. That's a brilliant point, actually, though, to talk about, when you enter into the feeling with the person. And then a lot of people, like, especially if you're empathic, an empath, that you can be taken away with that and end up, not actually helping the person. But like we talked about before, is like being the lighthouse and not getting into the lifeboat with the person, you're you're empathizing, but you're giving them the tools so they can help themselves. You're not trying to fix anything.
Mm.
So there's a really fine line there, and that's brilliant to point out, because there's a lot of people they feel so much for other people, and then they want to enter into, and they become completely depleted then,
Mm.
because they're
Mm.
giving of themselves completely, and they feel like they're nearly absorbed into the other person's pain as such,
Mm.
and they
Mm.
can't feel their own selves. They've lost themselves in the other person's experience as such. But then
Mm.
it's kind of like an awareness of that might happen, and then to keep pulling yourself back into your own heart, and say that, yeah, I can feel your feelings, but I support you by giving you the tools and the resources to help yourself.
Mm.
That's the difference, because
Mm.
they're growing. It's a growth stage for them, for you. So it's that's the difference, rather than trying to fix everything, and you're never really going to fix anything if the other person isn't doing the work themselves.
Mm. Mm.
So
Mm.
the most loving thing is just to be there with them, feel it, but then say, these are the tools, like, these are the practices, this is the process that's worked for me, and maybe you could try that too. I think that's the solution
Mm.
to being there, but not losing yourself in it, I guess.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also about emotional maturity, right? It's like
Mm,
when I
mhm,
understand that, because often that's a strategy that we learn as a child when we feel a little bit like we feel insecure, or we feel like our needs aren't being met. The strategies are to actually overcompensate
mm,
for other people, or to do too much for other people. And I think even being an empath, or like having that feeling responsibility for others,
mhm,
that was the strategy that we used in order that we would still be of value in our family
mhm.
system. So that's also the growth for us, right? It's like, how can I share this
Absolutely.
experience with this person and be present in this moment with this person
Mm,
without having to feel like I'm responsible, and with
yeah,
being aware that once upon a time I needed to do that to maybe be of value.
yeah,
So yeah, it's sort of growth for both parties, right?
absolutely. Because that's codependency, isn't it?
Mm.
When
Mm.
you're in that, trying to fix, trying to, and you know, it's a tricky one, because it's all about awareness, isn't it? When you
Mm.
see yourself in that pattern of, why I'm doing this, why do I want to fix, but still you don't want to shut down and become cold and not feel, because
Mm.
that's who you are in your truth, that you feel. But how do you just then realize, given, like I said, the tools or the practices? That's why coaches and mentors are brilliant, because they can do that, but they can also give you this solutions or tried and tested practices that actually work. They're
Mm.
not projecting their own experiences onto you, and that's what happens sometimes as well. You're not projecting your experience onto the other person. So that's, I suppose, when it's more sympathy. People are sympathetic to some of the experience because they've gone through it themselves. But I suppose empathic is more about trying to understand, understanding. And in the design process, like, empathy, or is the number one step on that process, where you're trying to seeking to understand the issues, seeking to understand, and then trying to find a solution to move forward with. So
Mm.
trying to move forward, but that you're not, like you say, responsible for other person's difficulties, I suppose. And sometimes, like that, yeah, that's a sign of codependent kind of
Mm.
pattern, I guess, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah,
I was
and it
talking to
takes
sorry.
practice to move away
Yeah,
from that, doesn't it?
it does, and it very much comes down to how empowered we are in ourselves. Because the
Mm,
more empowered I am, the less I need to run those strategies. But just talking from a parent's perspective, I was talking to a parent about this the other day, and that the best thing that we can do, especially when we have teenagers, for example, is being able to share that feeling, but actually being able to sit in that feeling of, I don't have a solution, I don't know what to do. Because as soon as a parent, I react and I feel responsible for finding a solution and creating some sort of different outcome, then I get in the way of what needs to unfold.
Yes.
Because there always is a solution, an optimal solution waiting to unfold.
Yeah.
But if I'm in my head about it, and if I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm the parent, I've got to try and fix this, I've got to find a solution, all of a sudden, I'm not going to be emerging into that next moment where the solution is. I've stopped that from happening and I've resisted it. And that creates the disconnection. And that is not going to help anybody really feel as connected or move towards the solutions that really are going to help the situation. But I think from a parent, I don't know about you, and I'm sure you've been through this too, like in those moments, like actually stopping yourself from doing anything and not acting and just being there in that moment in empathy. Very challenging as a parent, very challenging. But like I know that it works. It really works.
Absolutely, because it can see the solutions coming. Because I've probably told that story before about me when my kids were, excuse me, getting a little bit older, and I was trying to get them more independent when they were going to national school. I think they were coming up to fifth class, sixth class kind of thing, say 10, 11, even 8, 10, that kind of age. And I was trying to get them more independent, getting themselves ready in the morning. And I decided I wasn't going to do everything for them because it was my fault, like I was not fault, I wasn't blaming myself, but it was just pattern, like I was doing everything for them. So I actually had my chair that I sit on, and I actually went and I decided I'm going to go and I'm going to actually sit on my hands. And I actually went and sat on the chair and I sat on my hands because like Irish mammies are kind of notorious for like doing everything for their kids, and it was like all this conditioning was like, you have to do it, you do this, I was like, no, they're able to do it, but it was so difficult to stop myself from doing it. So it took a couple of weeks where every morning I would sit down at a certain time, a half an hour before they go to school, and I would just sit on my hands and I would move from the chair, and they'd ask me and I'd say, oh, it's in this, where's my whatever, and I'd direct them to where it was or where it might be with my voice, but I wouldn't do it for them. And eventually, after a couple of weeks, they became really independent and they knew how to get up and get their things ready and, get themselves ready. And they were in much better form. And I was in much better form, and everybody had kind of had a growth spurt. But it took an awful lot of strength in myself not to do what I instinctively had this urge to do, because it was just in my conditioning, I guess, to kind of do everything, constantly do everything. And that's what it feels like. It's like changing a pattern takes that kind of self-discipline as well, doesn't it? And the awareness of what you're doing is kind of causing what your frustration nearly, so the empathy of not wanting people to be in discomfort and your kids being in discomfort sometimes is a difficult thing that you have to overcome. So like it's like you say, like seeing that they're in pain and they're finding something difficult, but just being there with them, and then until they just move through that, and just having the trust that they can move through that into like finding the solution within themselves, because they have the capacity. And I suppose there's a more of a deeper understanding of that there's something emerging in that process of that heat, of the pain, of the struggle, that we emerge through that. And that when you're holding a space for that and trusting that the truth of the person is unfolding in a greater way, and that's really sacred, actually. It's a really sacred space to be present with and to witness, because really it's just being the witness of that, and then they can emerge themselves, and then you're just there to hold the space for that emergence.
Wow, that's great. Oh, what juicy conversation. Well, I think we might end that there.
Yes.
Thank you, Caroline. That was really good. Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Really interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Lovely to have you here, and we look forward to having you around and joining us next week. Same time, same
great.
place.
I hope a bit of food for thought anyway, isn't it?
Definitely.
Have a little reflection on that until we see you next week, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for watching
Thanks, everyone.
and listening, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.